Good evening and a very warm welcome to this special event hosted by our Chancellor and President of our Chancellor Circle, the Right Honourable Lord Campbell of Pittenweem. Part of the joy of the Chancellor Circle is our annual meetings in St Andrews and London, and extended in 2018 to the US, where we have enjoyed listening to various speakers over the years, providing us with entertainment, education and enlightenment. It's always a wonderful opportunity to reminisce and reconnect with friends old and new. In March earlier this year, we had our first online Chancellor Circle event, and we felt like under the circumstances at the moment, it was best to continue online for the time being. We're hoping that next year we'll all be able to meet again in person. But of course, one of the benefits of holding this event online is that we're also able to welcome many more guests who are not currently members of the Chancellor Circle. And indeed, we've got over 800 people signed up to join us this evening. So we are very excited about the large numbers that we're broadcasting to tonight. Despite our online presence, I'm pleased to acknowledge that this semester has seen a return to some semblance of normality for students. 95% of our students have returned to St Andrews in person with an easing of travel restrictions through the summer, and they're enjoying a mix of in-person and online teaching. Raisin Monday returned for the first time in 2 years, complete with a traditional foam fight on Lower College lawn. And we're currently in the midst of preparations for our winter graduations, with ceremonies scheduled to take place in person at the end of this month and at the beginning of December. It would be remiss not to mention that you are all now part of the UK's best university. I know you will have all heard that St Andrews ranked first in the Times and Sunday Times Good University Guide for 2022, which we like to refer to as the gold standard of domestic league tables, this September. This is, of course, the first time in the history of this or any other UK league table that an institution other than Oxford or Cambridge has come first. So, over to this evening. I'm delighted to be joined this evening by the Chancellor, Lord Campbell, for a conversation with St Andrews alumna, Dr. Fiona Hill. Fiona is Director of the Centre on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution in Washington, DC. From 2017 to 2019, she served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs on the National Security Council. Prior to that, from 2006 to 2009, she was at the US National Intelligence Council as the US government's top Russia analyst. She was a witness in the November 2019 House hearings regarding the impeachment inquiry during the first impeachment of Donald Trump. Her latest book, There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century, was published just last month. Fiona grew up in a world of terminal decay. The last of the local mines had closed, businesses were shuttering, and despair was etched in the faces around her. Her father urged her to get out of their blighted corner of northern England. And his full quote is, "There is nothing for you here, pet," he said. So the coal miner's daughter managed to go further than he ever could have dreamed. She studied at St Andrews, in Moscow and at Harvard, became an American citizen and served 3 US presidents. The Chancellor and Fiona will begin with a general conversation, following which I want to open up to pose questions from our audience. In order to do so, please post these questions in the chat bar on your screen at any time during the event. And if you have any difficulties, please email development-events@st-andrews.ac.uk. Now, I would ask if you have the chat bar facility that is only anonymous, if you could add your name to your question, that would be extremely helpful. So without further ado, please welcome the Chancellor, the Right Honourable Lord Campbell of Pittenweem.
Good evening. I regard it as a great privilege to be the Chancellor of St Andrews University. And as you've just heard, it brings with it being the President of the Chancellor's Circle, under whose auspices we're holding this event this evening. The Chancellor's Circle exists to encourage alumni and others, if thought fit, to support the university financially by making bequests in their wills. We call it, by the euphemism, estate planning. Today's event, which has brought more than 800 on the call, is in response to the book entitled There Is Nothing for You Here, which also, of course, has a subordinate title, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. And that shows, in the case in particular of Fiona Hill, how opportunity gave her the impetus towards personal success and the authorship of this book. As you've heard, Fiona Hill was the daughter of a miner, a proud occupation in Bishop Auckland, until the demise of the coal industry and the relative, I say, prosperity which went with it. She went, in her own colourful words, from the coal house to the White House. But this was no easy passage, as her book, There Is Nothing for You Here, eloquently sets out. And normally there's a sort of convention that if you interview someone who's produced a book, you invite those who are listening to buy it. Well, I do that without qualification because it's one of the best reads I've had in a very long time. There's nothing here for you. So there's nothing for you here was, as we've heard, the advice of her father. Fiona, what do you think was in his mind when he said that? I regard it as a rather courageous thing to say, because of course it would inevitably mean your departure from the family home to finish up who knows where. And in that recognition of the difficulties of staying where you were, he was actually making, I thought, a remarkably wise judgment. How did you regard it at the time?
Well, thanks very much, Chancellor, for having me here, and Robert, and everybody else. It's just wonderful to be able to do something with St Andrews, but one of the most critical places in my life story. I mean, certainly the university that put me on the path to where I am now. And for my dad in that period in 1984, I think actually he said this to me somewhere around 1983, 1984. He was making a calculation based on, the circumstances of not just where our family found itself, but where my home region of County Durham, Bishop Auckland is, one of the towns in County Durham in the northeast of England, had found itself. Like many places in the old industrial regions of the United Kingdom, in the 1980s, County Durham was facing hundreds of thousands of people being laid off from their jobs. This is the period of mass privatisation of the old nationalised industries, the heavy industry of the United Kingdom, coal mines, steelworks, shipbuilding, railway works, for example, everything that was actually the definition of work in the northeast of England at that period. And by 1984, when I was basically applying for university, I came to St Andrews at the, obviously in the autumn of that year. There was a massive youth unemployment crisis, not just an adult employment crisis. Basically, only 10% of school leavers in 1984 had something else to go on to. They might find a job eventually, but finding that job was going to be a pretty arduous and tortuous task. And as we might recall, contrary to the present situation, only about 5 or 6% of kids in the United Kingdom went on to college or university, polytechnic as it was, then, as well as universities. I mean, others might go on to apprenticeships and other kinds of training, but that was a very small percentage. So out of that 10%, about 5 and 6% were going to college and university, and 90% of people were trying to figure out what they were going to do with themselves. So I'd already started.
Were you ready to leave Bishop? Were you ready to leave Bishop Auckland? Had you taken a decision, perhaps if not expressly, but by implication, certainly applying for St Andrews University and other universities? I think you were driven around. You were driven around in a Mini by one of the members of your family visiting all these universities.
Yeah, that's right. And the thing is, in the northeast of England, we didn't really, apart from Durham and Newcastle, there wasn't a great deal of familiarity with other universities. I mean, St Andrews at first, I didn't really know very much about, apart from a neighbour had been there, and I mentioned in the book that there was a brochure of St Andrews, very clever, cunning marketing of St Andrews early on, back in the dark ages of the 1980s. It was in colour, and every other brochure and booklet from all the other universities were in black and white or very thin pamphlets. And I saw these glorious pictures of St Andrews, and I thought, oh, I wouldn't mind going there. And so the very fact that I'd decided to go to university and college, and that 5 or 6% of people had already put me on a different track. So when my dad was basically saying, well, look, if you apply to go to university, you know, as he said, there's nothing for you here, pet, you know, when you finish at the other end. If you've got a qualification, you've got an undergraduate degree, you're not going to be coming back to Bishop Auckland, or probably not even County Durham in the North East. You're going to have to start thinking of something else. So that mere fact of applying to university, and of, you know, particularly when St Andrews became the place, was already going to put me on another path. And elsewhere in the book, I say that once I got to St Andrews, the realization set in quickly that, just like my dad said, I would not go back to the Northeast. I was from the Northeast, but I was no longer living in the Northeast of England, and I was likely not to go back there again.
Now, can I put something to you, which occurred to me? You left Bishop Auckland, you went to St Andrews University, you moved on to Harvard, you became an expert on Russia, you became an American citizen, you gave evidence in the impeachment of Donald Trump, and you become, because of the nature of that evidence and the coverage it entailed, an internationally recognized public figure. Did you conceive in any way of that sort of progress in your life at the moment that you wore, the first moment you wore the red gown at St Andrews?
Certainly not to those, you know, kind of framing. And, you know, also during that impeachment trial, which again, I was certainly not anticipating, I found myself sitting next to another St Andrews graduate, David Holmes, who was the US diplomat who had been assigned to the embassy in Kiev in Ukraine. So there were two of us on the particular session in the impeachment that I found myself. So that was, I don't think he would have anticipated either. We were both surprised to realise that we were both St Andrews graduates in that moment when they read out our biographies. But look, when I went off to St Andrews in 1984, I'll tell you what I thought I might become. I thought I might become an interpreter, or maybe, you know, if there was a good chance, I thought that there was a possibility that perhaps I might be able to join, you know, the British Foreign Service in some way, and, you know, as some kind of junior diplomat, maybe get involved one way or another in nuclear arms control. Because the reason I decided to study Russian in the 1980s was because of the Euro missile crisis, which of course, you know, Chancellor, you will remember, and, you know, many of your parliamentary colleagues, when we were faced with the prospect and the threat, but the prospects seem more real, not just the threat of a nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States over the stationing of missiles in Europe, SS-20 and Pershing missiles. And of course, you know, this was the era of the campaign of nuclear disarmament, the Greenham Common Women, you know, which we're looking back on now, you know, 30 years after the end of the Soviet Union, this December, and looking back on the 1980s and remembering that whole period, that there really was an acute sense of tension. And I decided in that time to study Russian as a way of kind of figuring out, you know, what to do, and also for myself as something concrete that I could try to do against this backdrop of impending doom. I mean, honestly, in my classes when we were doing our A-levels, people saying, why are we bothering? We're just going to be blown up. You know, what's the point of this? You know, much as young people now are looking at the climate, we were looking at the nuclear climate, the nuclear environment, and very worried about our futures.
Well, of course, it wasn't long after Khrushchev tried to run missiles into Cuba and had to be faced down by President Kennedy. I think it was all part of that period. Well, in a sentence, what did St Andrews give you? Confidence, experience, learning? I mean, what, as you graduated, what did you say to yourself you'd got out of St Andrews? Not in any transactional sense, but what did you think you'd got out of it?
Well, I got all of those things that you mentioned, knowledge, also an incredible network of friends and, you know, future contacts. And just look, for me, it was an incredible privilege to be at St Andrews. I mean, I'm not at all surprised. I'm just surprised it's taken so long that St Andrews would be ranked, you know, in the #1 in the United Kingdom. It was always a really special and amazing place. And just, you know, the opportunity to study in such a historic environment and contemplate all the other people who had preceded me. I mean, more than 600 years now with scholarship in St Andrews. It gave me knowledge and gave me perspective. And look, it really gave me an opportunity, the theme of the book. And it opened a lot of doors. St Andrews helped me get a scholarship to the Soviet Union in 1987, 1988. That put me on my career track. It linked me up with alumni. I had George Robertson, who was suggested to me as somebody to write to about career advice by the Career Service, and he went on, of course, to become Lord Robertson, one of your fellow life peers, but NATO Secretary General and UK Defence Minister. At the time, he was an MP for Scotland, and I wrote him a letter, and he wrote back. These kinds of things. St Andrews opened those doors to mentorship, and St Andrews also helped me with my applications for my fellowship, my scholarship to Harvard. So I'm really grateful, for example, to people like Frank Quinault, who was the wonderfully named hebdomader back then, and also on some of the student advisory groups that helped me find fellowships and grants. My local education authority paid for my entire education at St Andrews, but St Andrews also gave me bursaries. So I would just say, in one word, opportunity. That's what St Andrews gave me.
You also had help from someone I also know called Derrick Foster, who
yes, indeed,
unhappily died. I think he was your local member of Parliament. He was the chief whip to the Labour Party in Parliament, but he was universally admired and regarded. And so you had these two politicians, as it were, giving you a push in the right direction. At last, something good to say about politics and politicians. When you went to Harvard, did you find it challenging? I mean, given its reputation, given the fact nowadays it has its reserves are something like $80 billion. I mean, it is the university of all universities. Were you in any way cowed by that, or had St Andrews given you sufficient self-confidence?
Well, St Andrews had certainly given me self-confidence. I mean, I knew my stuff when I got there, and I'd spent a year, thanks to St Andrews' intercession as well, in the Soviet Union. And it was that year in the Soviet Union that had opened the door to finding a scholarship at Harvard, by some weird, quirky ways that I, relay out in the book. And so I felt very well prepared in my studies of history and Russian when I got to Harvard. But Harvard was kind of like a city-state, it's kind of like Vatican within Rome. It was kind of a place set apart, not just the red brick walls and everything. And yes, it was quite intimidating, also very historic. That was old as St Andrews, but, the oldest of American universities. But what was amazing there was just the wide breadth and the diversity of people who were studying there. And as you said, the resource base, because it's very hard for a smaller, British university. I mean, Oxford and Cambridge have got these, huge endowments, but they pale in comparison with Harvard's. And certainly for a university like St Andrews, it's very difficult to kind of compete in that same way of the resource base. But look, I think in terms of the calibre of the student body, the calibre of the teaching and, the knowledge base, St Andrews is up there as well. Harvard, of course, is just huge. So many different schools. And again, an opportunity on a different scale. And of course, it opened that portal to the United States. I mean, Harvard is something of a world apart, but it's not just an ivory tower. There's an awful lot of practical work going on at Harvard, just like St Andrews, in terms of research and opening up to the world. And what I found was perhaps, the greatest opportunity there was when I got involved in working with the Kennedy School of Government, Professor Graham Allison, who'd been the dean of the Kennedy School there, and had all these practical programs, including technical assistance projects to what was then still the Soviet Union, but would soon be, modern Russia and the new successor states, the Soviet Union. Again, the 30th anniversary of that coming up. And that ability to apply knowledge in a very meaningful way and to see impact of that. And that was actually going back to Derrick Foster, who mentioned, my local MP. He'd come to my school, very under-resourced. The comparison between my school, Bishop Barrington Comprehensive School, St Andrews and Harvard, is just, there is none. And at Bishop Barrington, we were all kind of struggling, trying to kind of find our way. And Derrick Foster came and said, look, you can define yourselves through education, redefine yourselves. You're not constrained by circumstances with a really good education. But education is a privilege, and it's something that you have to apply. Don't gain knowledge through education to just sit there and do nothing. You have to go out there. He'd been an education secretary in County Durham and Sunderland. He took his role as an MP very seriously. He knew his education himself. for himself had been something that had pushed him forward. So I was already instilled from that encounter, that early encounter with Derrick Foster, in the idea that I had to apply my knowledge and my education. And I found the opportunity to do that at Harvard in ways that I wouldn't have expected.
After Harvard, you moved into the world of think tanks, I believe. But your experience there wasn't always, shall we say, felicitous. I mean, I read perhaps expressly, but certainly between the lines, that you would identify a lot of male resistance, that you were somehow, I mean, I also think you have a steely determination, if I may say so. But it wasn't easy being a woman with a speciality like Russian, being bluntly taken seriously. Am I right to interpret what you tell us in the book as strongly as that?
Yeah, and look, I mean, I would say that's still the case in many contexts. I was very struck at St Andrews, and again, things have changed considerably with the passage of time. But back in the early 1980s, I didn't have a single female professor. I mean, partly that might have been the issues and the subjects that I'd chosen. I mean, there certainly were female faculty at St Andrews. It's just I didn't get the opportunity to study with any of them. I did have language instructors who were women, and that was the same when I went to Moscow at the Translators Institute that I stood up for the year. There were women instructors. When I went to Harvard, I didn't have a single female professor either. And although there were women in the field, a lot of them, were marginalised and were not full professors. It was very difficult to get a full professorship at St Andrews, and I at Harvard and St Andrews as well. But at Harvard, I was very struck by a lot of the stories that I heard from older women who I really admired, including some of them had made it into the faculty, that they themselves had been told often, why do you want this job? Doesn't your husband have a good job? Why would you want a salary if your husband's got a good salary? Or some women literally being told, particularly in the economics and other professions, that this is not for you. And I started to experience moving into the national security field. There were an awful lot of women in my generation, sort of my cohort, women a few years older than me. There were a lot of women in the graduate school. I mean, I think now we look at statistics, there are often more women who were undergraduates and more women who were graduates, but they were getting kind of filtered out, so to speak, as we rose up. And it was really taking a lot of collective effort to push forward. And so I did start to experience that. The one thing that was really jarring was the women's pay gap. And coming from a working class background in the northeast of England, I have to say there was a lot of pay transparency. When I got a job cleaning at my local hospital, the wage, the hourly salary was posted. It was the same. It didn't matter who you were. My dad was a porter at the hospital. I made the same hourly salary as my dad did in my cleaning job that I had, part-time. Of course, that was a little embarrassing about thinking about how much harder, my dad had been working, and the fact that that was the same salary, but it was all transparent. When I got to the think tank world, the university world, I found that there was all of this behind the scenes secret bargaining. And as it became revealed later, when people talked to each other, and also in a lot of research coming out of places like Harvard Business School, as a kind of a matter of course, women tended to be making $20,000 a year, basically on average, less than men. And I experienced that right from the beginning. I ended up in a role in which I had the oversight to budget, so I could see this. And so, I was able to trace this all the way through my professional life until it finally got rectified. And I wanted to write about this in the book because there's a big debate, for women and women's pay. I mean, obviously for someone like me who's risen, from the bottom, cohort in society to the top, I'm now in a very privileged position. But I thought to myself all the time, what if I'd still been, Fiona working, kind of in either a blue collar job or, somebody who was a single mother, for example, and my whole family would be dependent on my salary. Those kinds of discrepancies become a huge problem, and collectively they're a drag, on society. And we're still right in the middle right now because of COVID, the pandemic, a whole debate about women and their ability to work, lack of childcare, and especially problems for single women. And the point in the book is that if this was such a barrier for me to opportunity, despite everything that I'd achieved academically, then, what is it like for, other women and also minorities, people with disability, people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, there's those kinds of wage discrimination as well. So I wanted to highlight that as part of the barriers to opportunity that I experienced along the way in my career.
Change the tack. You became a United States citizen. Why was that?
Well, look, when I got to the United States and after a certain period of working here, and I realized, I'm sitting in the United States, right now as we're speaking, so when I say here, I mean, here in the US, where I am, I did see an awful lot of opportunity that opened up that, frankly, I felt was cut off for me at home in the United States, the United Kingdom. In the United States was a sort of chance to reinvent myself, to not have the same kind of class and, regional baggage, to be able to apply my knowledge in really a very meaningful way that, I hadn't seen the immediate pathway in the United Kingdom. I met an American and married an American. There was part, right, but that was along the line. That wasn't immediately either. But there was also, very much a kind of sense of, after a period of time, and I'd been working in the United States, a sense of commitment. And I would say that after 9/11 and the terrorist attacks on the United States, I really felt that I wanted to give something back. The United States had given me an immense amount of opportunity in that time frame, and I wanted to become a citizen and to be able to enter into public service as well.
Yes, that was my next question. I take it was necessary if you wanted to enter into public service. Perhaps you tell us a little bit about that. How many presidents did you, as it were, serve under doing public service?
There was 3. I mean, when I was at the National Intelligence Council as the National Intelligence Office of Russia and Eurasia, it was the end of the administration of George W. Bush, because I began at the very beginning of 2006 and I ended that service at the end of 2009. So I was there for the first year of Barack Obama's administration. Right. And now in this case, I was actually loaned out by the Brookings Institution under what was called an interpersonal agreement. And so I basically spent time in government service as a non-partisan professional, but I was actually loaned out for that period. Yes, so it was, and then I returned to Brookings.
Right. And of course, you then, jumping ahead a bit, because of course this is, I may say I read your section of the book on this. I couldn't put it down. I mean, it is just so extraordinary. You went to work in the White House as part of the National Security Council, based, I think, on your well-known and accepted Russian expertise. But your account of how policy was created in that White House under that president is quite extraordinary. Would you like to give us a flavour of it?
Yes, look, it wasn't quite what I'd expected based on my previous times in office. I mean, again, I was asked to go in on a non-partisan expert basis. I mean, it's a sort of little known fact, however, that I was recruited by, in fact, President Trump's first national security advisor, General Flynn, who became, something of, and still is rather a controversial figure in US politics. But General Flynn and I had worked together when I was on the National Intelligence Council. He'd been my counterpart in the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff's office over at the Pentagon. We'd worked very closely together on Russia and on a number of other issues. And I'd also met the woman who would become his Deputy National Security Advisor, Katie McFarland, who was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. And when I'd done my work on Vladimir Putin and written with a colleague 2 books on Putin, she'd invited me to participate in her programs on Fox News. I also knew quite a lot of other people who they were recruiting to the National Security Council at that time, including people I'd worked with at the National Intelligence Council. And in all the discussions behind the scenes, there was a view of how to, given all the Russian interference in the 2016 elections, all the scandals, about Russia and the vitriol of the campaign, about how we would craft, given this very heated and unusual domestic situation, a coherent policy to push back on Russia and make sure that Russia couldn't interfere again. Particularly dealing with the cloud that had been over President Trump and the 2016 elections. They were all very well aware of that. We had all these discussions, again, mostly I had them with Katie McFarland and then also General Keith Kellogg, who was the executive secretary of the National Security Council. But they were hoping that I would be able to sit with them and help to sort of explain to President Trump what made Putin tick. Well, none of that, of course, happened. General Flynn, I mean, I never even got to meet with him. He had the shortest tenure of any national security advisor in history. By the time I came on, it was H.R. McMaster, someone I'd only known in very general terms before from a couple of conferences. So I had to, re-establish myself with him, create a relationship. He was replaced after a year with John Bolton, Ambassador Bolton, again, somebody who I didn't know especially well. I'd given myself a 2-year term in this administration, knowing that it would be very politically highly charged. There was a lot of churn. Right from the very beginning, I was attacked by all kinds of people for being part of various conspiracy theories. I was really shocked, to be honest, at the domestic politics. I went into the administration worried about national security, thinking that that was what I was going to work on, and found myself all embroiled by all kinds of fantastical fictions about who I was associated with, in the middle of all of this domestic politics. And of course, ending up as a fact witness along with many other of the people I'd served alongside, non-partisan public servants in that first impeachment trial. And behind the scenes, what I kept seeing over and over again, and I've described this in detail in the book as you lay out, is this efforts to privatize United States foreign policy and national security policy. It wasn't something I expected at all. And finding myself embroiled in so much intrigue that I couldn't keep it straight in my own head. All kinds of characters, in the United States I'd never heard of. And now, of course, I know more about them than I care to know about them. And I came away with the conclusion that United States politics and the politics in that White House was more filled of intrigue and chaos than anything I'd ever experienced in and around the Kremlin, which I'd spent, my whole adult life, really watching. Kremlin politics was like a little stroll in a park in contrast with what was actually happening in the Trump White House. And that's also just this churning through people getting accused of all kinds of ridiculous things, over and over and over again, and constantly getting sacked, no continuity of personnel, and everything focused on one very populist president who wanted to turn the presidency into his own personal sinecure.
Yeah, I believe you were regarded as a plant for Soros, isn't that right?
Among many other things.
Yes. And also, I mean, that gave rise to some quite unpleasant social media, including, I think, threats to yourself and your family. Isn't that right?
That's correct. And this was on the basis of the fact that, back in the very early 2000s, I'd been on the advisory board of the Central Eurasia Project, the Open Society Institute, the advisory board in particular at the American University in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. And, so how this then got transplanted into this larger conspiracy. But the conspiracy about Soros that I talk about in the book is fascinating because it's kind of a modern day version of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a heavily anti-Semitic conspiracy that was generated in the early 1900s for political purposes. And in fact, the conspiracy around George Soros was invented by a couple of political operatives based in New York who happen to be Jewish themselves. So there's, some strange angles to this, who were trying to help the campaign of Viktor Orban in Hungary to run for prime minister. And he needed a political foil. And George Soros became the person that they kind of invented as his political enemy, inventing all kinds of stories about George Soros being involved in Hungarian politics. And that was then adapted later for President Trump and for others. So it was a completely manufactured, as conspiracy theories tend to be, a completely manufactured issue. And then they were looking for people to fit into it. And I was slotted in. People put up on, and they still have it on Twitter and on the internet, my, form that I'd filled in when I was a uncompensated advisor to this, Open Society's Eurasia program, and the work at the American University of Bishkek, all of it completely above board, but people put up on the internet my name, my home address, all kinds of things. And then the amount of conspiracy that was, it's been fascinating. At some point I'm going to write more in detail about it, that and many other conspiracies that have emerged.
Yeah, I mean, you lasted pretty well your 2 years. I think it was the virus that eventually when you had to go back home, and I think that was probably the thing that persuaded you it was time to leave. But I mean, there was an occasion when the president thought you were a secretary, is that right? And also it's also the case that you've taken a fairly substantial cut in salary, and that leads me to a point you go out of your way to make, which is that in the White House there was all this fake policy, if you like, but on the other hand there were people there, public service appointees like yourself, who had smaller salaries than the political individuals, and who had come into the White House out of a sense, rather as you did, I think, of public duty and responsibility. And I think you certainly go out of your way to say that these people really were taken advantage of. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, they were also completely abused. They were always being accused of being deep state, kind of unelected bureaucratic coup plotters. The majority of people that I work with were honestly in this particular National Security Council from the military, the uniformed military, people who were either detailed directly from the armed services, or people who were veterans. In other words, people who'd served in the military, had then retired, and still wanted to serve the country and had come into the National Security Council. There was a massive preponderance of veterans there, men and women, many of whom had been in Iraq and Afghanistan. Some of them had been injured, heavily decorated. And then others were, public servants who had been in the government for decades. Again, non-partisan, people that were all being accused of being Democrats or Soros plants or, God knows what. But they were all people who had basically devoted themselves to public service, non-partisan. I couldn't tell you what most of their political backgrounds were, despite all these accusations that were being directed at them. And many of them were indeed drawing extremely small salaries. They could easily have gone out into the private sector, but they did not. Many people, in the federal executive service have to have advanced degrees because the jobs are very technical, so that people like myself with, degrees and, knowledge. But many people were, the special assistants, the secretaries, the people who made the place run. And many people were also detailed from places like the Coast Guard, where their salaries are really very small. And they were all being attacked all the time, saying they were part of being a privileged caste. And then there was the big battle and the showdown over the budget. And President Trump called a government shutdown. And all of the people had to work for weeks on end without any pay whatsoever. And many of the people that I was working with were in quite desperate straits. They blew through their savings. They were the only breadwinner in their family. There were a lot of single parents, I worked with across the staff. And all of this is hidden behind the scenes. And this myth developed about all the public servants being, somehow antagonistic towards the president and trying to bring him down. And so we were in the midst of this battle between the president and the state throughout the whole of Donald Trump's presidency. He wanted to basically run the country from the Oval Office, but without the state, at the expense of the state apparatus.
Well, it's a long way from President Bartlett and West Wing, isn't it? Which we all
followed from that, I would say.
with such enthusiasm. But the particular issue I wanted you to tell us about, there was the summit arranged in Helsinki between Putin and President Trump. And you had the responsibility of preparing him for that purpose. I wrote it down because I think you said it in terms. He simply didn't read the papers. Is that right?
That's correct. He wasn't very interested in having the briefings from staff. President Trump, again, you have to put it in from his perspective. I mean, I understand and understood where he was coming from. He's somebody who'd never had any government experience before. His view of the presidency was a pretty singular one, that it was the president, it wasn't an executive branch, the executive was the president. He was aware that the presidency in the United States is three things in one: the head of state, the commander-in-chief of the military, and then the chief executive. In his viewpoint, that was then not that dissimilar from him in his role as the head of his family business of Trump Enterprises. And he didn't understand, how everything else fit into that. Certainly checks and balances were anathema to him. He believed that, kind of once the president was directly elected by the population, we've got to remember again that a president in the United States is in fact directly elected. President Trump wasn't a member of the Republican Party for any length of time. He basically joined the Republican Party to get elected as president. And so his belief was the president stood above everything else. And so his point of view was that information filtered down from him, not up. Everybody was staff, and there wasn't anything that anybody else could tell him about the particular issue. So his view was that he was like the CEO, and Trump was, then in his previous jobs at the head of, the Trump family firm, he'd meet with other CEOs, and then people would work out the details. So his viewpoint of Helsinki and meeting with Putin was, as it had been in previous encounters, was that he would sit down with Putin, they would thrash things out, and then everybody else would work out the details. He wasn't really interested in what we had to say to him. He just wanted to get on with the meeting with Putin, and then, we'd all take it from there.
Yeah, the interesting thing, of course, and you dwell on this to some extent, was the fact that he was, as it were, as if it was playing chess, he was beaten by Putin on one particular issue, which was the allegation that there had been Russian interference in the presidential election. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Look, that was an absolute, disaster, obviously, that moment. That was not in the one-on-one meeting between Putin and Trump. That was in the press conference. So the one-on-one meeting between Trump and Putin was actually fairly standard fare, apart from the fact that Putin tried to pull a fast one about the indictments of some GRU or Russian military intelligence agents by the FBI that had just happened a day or so before, and he was trying to, suggest that in return for those FBI agents being basically interrogated or questioned by the FBI, the GRU agents, then Russia would like to basically interview some people of its own in the American context. That created a big kind of scandal, but that wasn't anything that we could have prepared President Trump for, because that was just one of the classic Putin ploys of trying to stir the pot. What happened at the press conference was unfortunately entirely predictable, because there was a huge scandal, as everybody knows, in the United States about the idea that the Trump campaign had colluded with the Russians and the Russian intelligence services and the Russian government on some points in 2016. I had never bought into this. There was, a kind of a dossier that was prepared by a former MI6 agent, somebody who I happen to know from my time at the National Intelligence Council, and I kept in touch with. When that was all revealed, it was obvious to me that this was all just a complete diversion and a rabbit hole. But this was picked up by the US press. And of course, everybody, kind of was bought into this idea based on that something had happened during the campaign. In actual fact, President Trump had invited, kind of Russian involvement in the campaign by, appealing to the Russians to release Hillary Clinton's emails, which in fact they did. And there was all kinds of, strange meetings between members of the Trump campaign, including Trump's own son, Don Jr., and a bunch of dodgy Russians who, if I'd ever heard about this, I would advise them not to meet with. I've met with the same people. It was kind of obvious, where they were going to go with this. But the bottom line was the Russians had been trying to interfere in the election to cast a cloud over whoever was going to be president. Their whole point of their intervention was to make everybody feel insecure, illegitimate, and to be worried about the outcome of the election, had it been, played out in some way. If Hillary Clinton had been elected with a narrow margin in the Electoral College, she would have had the same sets of problems because of the Russians stirring the pot. Donald Trump, however, he was always set off by the questions about what happened in the 2016 election. Did the Russians interfere on your behalf? Part of it was fear that Trump might be told by Putin, well, yes, in fact, Donald, I did interfere on your behalf and I got you elected. I mean, that's frankly what the Russians, loved the most about all of this great mess, was this idea that somehow they had elected an American president and, damaged the candidacy of Hillary Clinton rather than American voters basically electing the president, which was the case. And whenever President Trump was presented with that question, he basically reacted in an extraordinarily negative fashion. We knew this from the inside. We knew that this press conference was likely to be a disaster if he was asked that question in front of Putin. And it's also, he greatly admired Putin. He was always talking about how strong and powerful Putin was. I describe in the book his kind of autocrat envy. He loved strong men. And he says this openly. He said this to Bob Woodward, in the interviews for his book. He said it all the time in front of all of us. He liked Putin, he liked Xi, he didn't like China, but he liked Xi. He didn't necessarily like Russia, but he liked Putin. He liked Erdogan of Turkey. He really liked Orban of Hungary, and he liked the Queen. Now, the Queen is not a strong man, but it's all about the celebrity, it's about the influence, it's about the image, and it's also about that idea of strength and power. And in Helsinki, when he was asked the question about Putin interfering, all of these things came together. And what we saw was a meltdown on the part of President Trump trying to divert the question away. And of course, this was massively humiliating, not just for him, but for the United States as well. But it was entirely predictable because of all of the mess that was going on in the United States at the time. We had preferred that there wasn't a press conference, but President Trump was also always going to want to have a press conference. Joe Biden just quite recently decided not to have a joint press conference with Putin, probably not wanting, to have the same optics of all these difficult questions and things being asked as well.
Yeah. Now, we've got a part of the program is to allow some of the other people to ask questions. So I wonder if I could just take you through something, because you mentioned finding opportunity in the 21st century. And I've read chapters 15 and 16, which are headed "No More Forgotten People, No More Forgotten Places." And then you go on very powerful conclusion in which you say that, I mean, in a way, this is, I hope you won't feel insulted by it, but it's a kind of echo of Boris Johnson, because you're talking about a highly skilled workforce, high productivity and high wages. And you say that opportunity has to be made for that. And the only way that that can be created is through education. And it was rather interesting because some of it read to me like a party manifesto. So maybe it's the Hill party.
Yes, it's not. This could be for any party, basically.
But just in a sentence or two before we open it up to the other people on the call, you obviously regard your experience and the opportunity which you got through education as being self-evidently fundamental to your achievements. And what I deduce you to say is that if we are going to have a workforce and a society which continues to make progress, then we have to embrace this whole notion of education at every level.
At every level, yes.
Yeah, at every level.
At every level.
The one thing I would say to you, I think it's very strong. These two chapters are very strong on analysis and they're strong on solutions. And I sort of summed them up actually in a way. I hope you don't mind. I mean, you're talking about people. It's money, mobility, and freedom, in a way. I mean, there has to be money. People have got to move. There's stories about people not willing to move from one Welsh valley to another, and freedom. And you demonstrate, I think, all of these qualities, and it's these qualities, I think, which gives this very interesting prospectus, if you like. I think we've reached the point when we would like to allow some of the people who are on the call to ask questions, and I'll pass you back in a moment or two. But for my part, thank you very much indeed. I have really enjoyed our conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed the book. As I said to you, I think the other day, I'm hoping to be in Washington next week, and maybe we'll have a chance to catch up then. But otherwise, I put you in the hands of the question master.
Thank you so much, Chancellor. Robert, just before you begin, let me just have one quick response to the Chancellor's last point. Because there's political implications from forgetting about people and forgetting about places and not investing in the very issues that you laid out there. And those political implications we saw in 2016 with all the fights over Brexit in the United Kingdom. And the people who voted for Brexit were for the most part the people who felt that they were left out of development in the rest of Britain. And that might be the fault of Brussels, but it was also very much seen to be a call to Westminster, to where you're sitting now, and to Parliament and to the government to invest more in places that had been forgotten. And it was also they factor in the 2016 election of Trump, and again in the 2020 election of Biden, and also the larger votes for Trump, because there is an expectation that someone, the man in the White House in this case, really needs to do something to address all of these socioeconomic as well as, you know, political and cultural grievances that come out of it, of places being forgotten and people being forgotten and not feeling that they're fully participating in society. And if you look in Russia, the mainstay of Putin's support is from all the old kind of industrial cities. It's not the big cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg that are flourishing, but it's all the kind of places that are kind of left out of the dynamism. And when you leave people behind, you leave places behind, because a lot of people can't leave. They can't have that mobility. As you said, people can't often move from one Welsh valley to the other because all of their investment in terms of their family, their homes, you know, kind of is there, and they haven't got necessarily the qualifications or the wherewithal, the knowledge where to move, because people don't have information. It was easier when I was a kid growing up to move to Canada, Australia, or take a fellowship to the United States than was to move to London. And I think that remains, you know, a big problem. So part of the book is to lay that out. St Andrews gave me a door. It gave me mobility, but not everyone can go to St Andrews. But everybody ought to have the opportunity for continuing education, skills, apprenticeships, new qualifications, you know, the roles of the Open University and further education colleges. There ought to be always something out there for everyone to be able to, you know, move themselves in a different direction.
Well, thank you very much for that. As I say, I much enjoyed these chapters, and I'll go back to read them again in the light of your analysis. Robert Fleming, you're in charge of the public.
Thanks, Chancellor. So you won't be surprised to learn that we've got a lot of questions. We're not going to be able to get through all of them, I'm afraid. But let me start with this one from David Walker, Fiona. You've worked in strengthening democratic institutions as well as becoming an expert on Russia and foreign policy. What is the state of democracy today and of our multilateral institutions? And are you optimistic?
Yes, well, I'm a bit pessimistic about the state of those institutions, but from the work that I did in strengthening democratic institutions, you know, back in the day in the 1990s, I actually have optimism that we can do something. So the issue gets back to what I was just saying in reaction to what the Chancellor had said, which is about making sure that our democratic systems deliver. And, you know, in the United States, for example, the whole idea of the American dream was all about mobility, social mobility. And now there's only a 7% chance in the United States of moving from the bottom 20% of society to the top 20%. And unfortunately, the UK isn't, you know, that far behind that in terms of, you know, single percentages. Whereas in other parts of Europe, you know, there's more like a 30-40% for social mobility. And that's part of the problem that we have here. That means, you know, then what's the point of democracy? That was actually the question that Russians and others asked themselves after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, where people found themselves impoverished by the mass privatization, all the dislocation of change. This was associated with them with democracy. And afterwards, there became much more of an interest in having a strong man, someone to fix it. And of course, we've seen over the last 21 years, Putin rolling back a lot of the freedoms and the democratic systems that had been set up in Russia in the 1990s. And it's the same thing that we're happening here in the United States and in the United Kingdom and more broadly in Europe in polling. People might be, you know, still interested in some of the individual aspects of democracy, but they've got a massive dissatisfaction with democratic institutions, particularly political parties and the mainstream political parties, which seem to have degenerated, not really representing people's interests, much more of an interest in more extreme or, you know, kind of different parties, or in protest, political protest or mobilization outside of the party system. And then there's, you know, kind of a question about the ability of our legislatures to be able to pass bills and other, you know, kind of legislation, thinking about the United States and Congress, that actually address people's needs. And so, you know, we are seeing a lot of dissatisfaction in similar ways that I saw in Russia in the 1990s, which, you know, I wrote about in the book, as this is sort of the ghost of our Christmas future if we're not very careful. But I do see the optimism in mobilization of people that I saw when I was working with the Eurasia Foundation, for example, and other philanthropic entities I work with, that people have an incredible capacity for mobilization for collective action. And I see a lot of benefit in public-private basically activities networks that are get formed up, universities and others taking the lead on addressing many issues. And so I do see an awful lot of potential for regenerating and reviving our democratic institutions, but from mobilization from people below. That's what we're seeing in the climate change space right now. We're seeing this in grassroots labour organisations that are, growing up in, response to what's happened with COVID and the whole future of work. We're seeing a lot of corporations being much more responsive to their customer base. And these whole ideas of ESG in the corporate world, environment, social responsibility and good governance, where, the corporate world is shifting. And that's also putting pressure on government to shift as well. So I do see optimism, but I think it's how we network together all of this mobilization at different levels in society. I talk about that a bit in the book, but I think that's what's going to be the challenge. But I think universities like St Andrews can also pave the way, with how they deal with issues of accessibility, affordability, the kind of like the moral imperative, to call for the broadening of education, for example. All of us can play a role here.
Thank you. Now, there's a few questions. I'm going to move very, very quickly. I'm sorry about that, but a few questions on a very similar vein, but this one from Anne McClintock Smith, a graduate of 1978. Do you ever contemplate going into politics yourself?
I don't actually, and I don't want to offend the Chancellor, because obviously each political system is quite different, but there's an awful lot of pandering to particular interests, particularly in the United States, where big money is required to enter politics. I mean, in the UK, I think it's very different, as the Chancellor would attest. I mean, there's limitations on the time of campaigning. There's limitations on campaign contributions. I know there's quite a few scandals at the moment, around the House of Commons. But in the United States, there are so many vested interests, so much money in politics, political action committees, dirty campaigning. I really think that you can be politically active without being partisan and without necessarily seeking a position in Congress or, say, in the House of Parliament. I think there's an awful lot that can be done through citizens' mobilisation. And I'm also, obviously, as people are probably aware, trying to speak out a lot on this. And, the book was a challenge to myself as well, to think about how I could be engaged more in making a difference without running for something. I don't want people's money and I don't want to run for something, but I do want to see about how we can all be mobilised to, in the words of my grandmother, which is of course really entrenched in Scottish humanism, make the world a better place than we found it when we came into it. That is infused throughout the whole of, I think the Scottish Enlightenment. My grandmother was a pretty devout Presbyterian, and I do think that, kind of, certainly for me, that was kind of one of my motivating forces. When I was a small kid, my grandma kept saying, look, we've got to leave the world a better place than we found it. And I talk about my grandma Vi in the book, and the way that she tried herself to make things better, for her family and, for the people around her. And we can all pitch in and do something.
Thank you. Now, I know you're not going to shy away from any question, and I'll give you a challenging one here. I would like to ask Dr. Hill, now that the Russian collusion hoax and the Steele dossier have been exposed as fakes, what does she feel regarding her own part in the subsequent politically partisan impeachment?
Well, the impeachment was indeed a spectacle of partisan politics, which I witnessed, but I was there as a fact witness, having given an oath to the Constitution as a public servant. So every single person who was subpoenaed to be brought before Congress, myself and all of the other people who testified with me, took an oath. This was our duty. And in a representational democracy, like the United States, Congress has oversight. So this was a perfectly legitimate and constitutional process. We were doing our duty. I have no hesitation, no regrets whatsoever about what I did there, but I cannot speak to the partisan infighting that was going on there in the members of Congress, which I was deeply disappointed in. And just to make very clear, I referenced the Steele dossier before because I'm the subject of many conspiracy theories about that too. And that, as I said repeatedly, and people can go back and look at both the testimony I gave behind closed doors, it's all there, hundreds and hundreds of pages for hours of it, as well as what I said in the testimony, that this was a rabbit hole. As soon as I heard about that, and I talked about when I was first given a copy to look at this, which was the day before it was published in BuzzFeed, I can't say that I would approve of that publication of this because it gave it a life of its own, which was much larger than it merited. It had apparently been circulating around for months before I actually saw it. I had no knowledge of how it was put together, despite knowing Christopher Steele and some of the other people who were involved in this. There were an awful lot of things like this, again, this very dirty political campaigning where each side was trying to dig up dirt on each other. And I do not approve of, that dossier or of any of the other, political action that were taken to kind of dig up dirt on campaign opponents. But the fact of the matter remains that the Russians interfered in our election in 2016. And there are also, sadly, facts that President Trump and his campaign were willing, to take on information that came from the Russians in the form of leaked emails from Hillary Clinton and the Democratic National Committee. And what we needed was a full, proper, thorough analysis of all of this without all of the politics. And we remain, I think, in a very dangerous position today because of all of these conspiracy theories and, kind of an unwillingness to acknowledge that the Russians messed about in 2016. And as I said many, many times, they were fueling conspiracy theories and fictional narratives for their own purposes. They will take advantage of any domestic and political and partisan infighting in the United States, the United Kingdom and anywhere else for their own purposes. And their whole goal had been to discredit the entire 2016 presidential campaign. And if that's what they set out to do, well, they succeeded, but with a heck of a lot of help from all of us. And so we have become our own worst enemies, fighting with each other and, privatizing foreign policy, accusing all kinds of people of being involved in conspiracies and not looking about, again, very cold and clear-headedly about what the Russians actually did in 2016. They wanted exactly this, to pit people against each other, to discredit people, and especially to discredit people like myself and others who are experts on Russia and know what they're doing. So whenever people engage in these kinds of things, we're doing exactly, very sadly, as I laid out at my testimony, what Vladimir Putin, the GRU, and other members of the Russian intelligence would actually like. They only exploit and play on information that they're given. They don't invent all of this. So we have to be very careful when we embark on, kind of attacking our fellow Americans or fellow Brits about the use that can be made of it by outside forces who don't mean as well.
Thank you, Fiona. Now, following on from that, this is a question from Brett Shevak. Watching your testimony in the impeachment hearings made me even prouder to have our daughter and now also our son at the University of St Andrews. However, I felt a great degree of shame as an American for the way you were treated. Frankly, I have never been more pessimistic about the political and socio-economic direction of the country. Do you share this perspective, or can you provide me some sunlight?
Well, I do share that perspective. I'm very worried about it, which is why I'm always speaking out about it. And I did decide to write the book, laying things out after I came out of the testimony. I mean, I'd been before I even went into the administration in 2016, thinking about writing a book about populism. And trying to look at, Russia and then, the way that, I think Putin is the first populist president of the 21st century, but the way that his style and approach to governance has rubbed off, very unfortunately, on many others. And now President Trump, has set a very different tone and approach to being a populist politician, in a way that many, many, many others are emulating. And that makes me very worried. Another reason why, I have since wanted to speak out very forcefully. But I have a great deal of optimism about people. In the United States case, there may be one president, but there are 330 million Americans. And at the preamble to the US Constitution, there is a phrase that was, of course, given to the Constitution and the preamble by none other than James Wilson, an alum of St Andrews, "We the people." It was at one point going to be "We the states of the United States of America," became "We the people." And I think that once people realise that they have agency and they can put "we the people" back into this, then we really can move forward. This is what I mean about this mobilisation. The founding fathers of the United States, including many Scots and many who'd studied at St Andrews, didn't foresee, the breakdown in party politics and the partisan nature of those politics. But they did foresee the importance of the involvement of the people. That was the heart of representative democracy. It's the heart of British democracy as well, and the mother of all parliaments. In Parliament, it's all about people and their individual votes, their individual agency, them having a voice. And the United Kingdom itself is really renowned for its volunteerism. Despite all of the problems that we've seen around COVID, I was just amazed by the role of the RVS, the Royal Voluntary Society, in support of the National Health System. All of the activities that people engage in to step up and to do something, and you see the same in the United States. The UK and the United States are very similar with civic activism, and I think that's where we really should be putting all of our energies, and we should be calling our politicians to attention. I mean, I'm deeply disappointed to see some of the impacts of the levelling up agenda, which you'd made a reference to the Prime Minister, Chancellor, and infrastructure, and bills that have been going through both the United States and the UK. People need to be connected. People need to have kind of things done by the government. I'm deeply disappointed to hear about this stepping back on connecting the north with rail. I can just tell you, as somebody who tries to visit my mum in the north of England, good luck with getting there most of the time. And if I can having a hard time getting there, and I've really got an incentive, what about investors and others, and people trying to move from one place to the next and find they can't unless they go through London. It's like ancient Rome. It's a long way to Rome, and it's a long way to London if you're in Hartlepool or Sheffield and places like this, for example. The same in the United States. All roads don't lead through Washington. There's lots of state and local government and community activity that can really kind of generate a response in Washington if elected Congress members are held to account. And everybody can write to their congressman, everyone can write to their MP, everyone can go and meet with their MP in their constituent hours, people can go and meet with their congressman in town halls, and we can hold them to account. Obviously in a civil way, but I mean, I think we need to basically get citizens activated and mobilized together in a positive direction. And that is what gives me hope, because I know that people are already engaging and thinking about things they can do. And I'm thinking myself actively about what more I can do.
Look, I realise we're already over time, but I think we've got some time that we can run over,
yeah,
and I really,
other people might have other things that they need to go to, like lunch.
Indeed, we've got
over there, for example. But yeah.
We've got a large American audience on the call today. We are inundated with calls. There are so many questions. People are obviously inspired by what you've got to say. Let me move the dial a little bit and ask a question from Susan Stewart, a contemporary of yours at St Andrews.
Susan.
Slight change of subject. On the back of COP26, how does Scotland, a sub-state actor, best use soft power to advance our international interests? And how might we more effectively utilise the Scottish diaspora and the tens of thousands of international students who graduate each year from Scottish universities?
Well, there's one thing that Scotland really has got going for it in the soft power domain, is that you never really hear anything bad about a Scots person, man and woman, when you're outside of Scotland and the United Kingdom. There is, like also for the Irish, an enormous amount of goodwill around the world. And I mean that most sincerely, especially here in the United States, where there's a very large wannabe Scottish diaspora, not just a Scottish diaspora, people whose linkage is to Scotland pretty tenuous, and kind of maybe go back to 1745 or even earlier, but they want to be part of that larger Scottish heritage. So Scotland already has a lot of soft power. It's got a good brand, a very strong brand. And, I think that is something to build on. I think then that enables Scotland to lead by the power of example. And education is one. And I mean, I know that Susan is heavily involved with the Open University of Scotland. And I think, showing the way that Scotland always has, with having, some of the oldest universities in the United Kingdom. I mean, after Oxford and Cambridge, it's not just St Andrews, but it's also Edinburgh and Aberdeen and Glasgow, and Scottish universities writ large have an incredibly reputation. So opening up those educational possibilities and the doors and keeping them open for people, using the Open University model as a pilot model that can be expanded in other places as well. I mean, the United States could do with an open university. I mean, this could be, using that leverage of, transatlantic ties through education, using the alumna network, an alumni network of all Scottish universities, to kind of show the open university idea of everyone can participate in education, no matter where they are and no matter what stage in their lives they are, for example. I think there's other in climate and COP26. that Scotland, like many other parts of the United Kingdom, had been moving quite fast towards renewables. I mean, obviously Scotland, has had North Sea oil and gas, but there's now an imperative to move. But there's wind, there's wave power, where Scotland has been a pioneer. Kat says solar power. I'm not being rude about the weather, but solar power is probably not one of Scotland's strengths. The Emirates and some of those very hot, sunny baking places, moving in that direction. I mean, there are, kind of other things that Scotland can do. Carbon sinking, restoring peat bogs, ancient peat bogs, kind of was one of the greatest opportunities for returning, carbon back to the earth, rather out to the atmosphere. There are all kinds of things that Scotland can bundle together here and show with the power of example. Scotland's also been very welcoming to refugees and to immigrants, despite, the small size of the population. I was always quite impressed by some of the programmes that Scotland had put in place on a local and community level. So I think that just as there was that wonderful book, in the past about how Scotland invented the modern world, there's still an awful lot of history, reputation, brand, and connections that Scotland can build on to show with the power of its example and show how programmes in Scotland could be scaled up, for other places and other settings.
Well, Fiona, I mean, thank you very, very much. We could go on for a very long time with the number of questions that we've had. I hope for anybody that hasn't already got your book that you'll inspire them to go and read it cover to cover now. We had a few comments, not questions, saying thank you for your service, your leadership, your integrity, and people are really delighted to have been on the call today. I can see that from the questions that we're not able to address today. So thank you very much, and I really, really hope that we can call on you again to do something similar, because it's been a very popular event, and I'm sorry that we've run late, but I hope that people will side with me in saying we didn't want to stop you in full flow earlier than we have to. And I know that we're going to be in the US next year. Fingers crossed that COVID restrictions will stay lifted and we'll be able to see you there. But thank you also for your service to today's St Andrews students, because I know you take a lot of calls, and like George Robertson took your call when you were a student, you're kind of paying it forward. So
Absolutely.
Thank you also for that.
Yeah, and I would encourage, if I could, Robert, just quickly, any other alums like myself who are listening in to do that for students, because that's building those networks and having these kind of cross-generational ties are very important for all of us. And I think with St Andrews has such an amazing network that we could mobilise St Andrews alums and students on any of these really important topics. St Andrews has got a lot to give, and I just really encourage people to get as much involved as they can.
I think that's as good a place as any to conclude today's offering. To thank Lord Campbell live from the House of Lords in London. Chancellor, we're very grateful for your input and your expertise in this area to be the master interviewer. And again, thank you, Fiona, on behalf of everybody on the call, and we hope to see you all at another event sometime soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.